A smug judge mocks Marcus, an 18-year-old accused of grand theft auto, but when Marcus defends himself, he dismantles the case, exposing a hidden conspiracy. The entire courtroom falls silent. Can Marcus prove his innocence and outsmart the system? Atlanta, Georgia, courtroom number 5. Just another morning, or so they thought. Marcus Reed, 18 years old, stood at the defendant's table, accused of grand theft auto and resisting arrest. Across from him sat Judge Richard Holloway, a rigid, no-nonsense man with little patience for young defendants. Nearby, Prosecutor Nathan Brooks stepped forward, his smirk full of confidence. To him, this was an open and shut case. A reckless teenager, a swift conviction, another easy win. Yet, in the tense, suffocating courtroom, Marcus remained eerily calm. He stood tall, hands in his pockets, his eyes steady and unreadable. Judge Holloway sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. "You think you're a lawyer? This isn't some high school debate club." Laughter erupted throughout the courtroom. To them, this was a joke, a foregone conclusion. They had no idea. They were dead wrong. The polished hardwood floor echoed with the steady click of Prosecutor Nathan Brooks' shoes as he stood, his charcoal gray suit crisp, his tie knotted to perfection. He moved deliberately toward the center of the courtroom, gripping his case file like a weapon, his confidence unshakable. With a smirk, Brooks opened the folder and spoke in a firm, calculated voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, today we present irrefutable evidence proving that the defendant, Marcus Reed, is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt." He raised his head, making deliberate eye contact with the jury before laying a stack of documents on the table. "First," Brooks continued, his tone dripping with condescension, "the defendant's fingerprints were found on the steering wheel of the stolen Ford Mustang." A few jurors nodded. They had heard this argument countless times before. Brooks took a step forward, pacing slowly. "Second, our witness, Officer Jason Fuller, personally saw the defendant behind the wheel before the car sped off." In the prosecution's seating area, Officer Fuller, dressed in a neatly pressed uniform, sat with a rigid posture. He gave a subtle nod as all eyes turned to him. "And finally," Brooks said, playing his trump card, "surveillance footage clearly places the defendant near the vehicle just moments before it was stolen." At that moment, the courtroom erupted with murmurs. People exchanged glances, whispering among themselves. To them, the case was clear. Marcus Reed, guilty. From his elevated bench, Judge Richard Holloway idly tapped a silver pen against his dark mahogany desk. He wasn't even trying to hide his boredom. Flipping through the case file, he barely skimmed the pages, reading them with the same level of interest as a diner menu. Then, sighing, he leaned back in his chair and gave Brooks an impatient glance. "All right, let's wrap this up," Holloway said, waving a dismissive hand. "I have a golf game at 2. Laughter rippled through the courtroom. A few jurors chuckled. Brooks smirked. Even the testifying officer allowed himself a quick, amused grin. To them, this trial wasn't about justice. It was just a formality before stamping the guilty verdict. But amid the laughter, Marcus remained still. No blinking, no fidgeting, no reaction. He stood there, hands in his pockets, his gaze locked onto Brooks, dissecting his every word, every breath. And then, just for a fraction of a second, in the middle of the sneers, the condescending smirks, Marcus saw it, the crack in their case. A flicker of sharp calculation flashed through his eyes. No one in that courtroom knew it yet, but this game wasn't over. The courtroom's murmur faded as Marcus Reed stood firm, his expression unreadable. Public Defender Lisa Thornton shifted slightly, ready to speak on his behalf, but before she could utter a word, Marcus gently placed his hand on her wrist. She hesitated. Marcus took a slow, steady breath, then lifted his gaze, his voice calm, yet razor sharp. "I will defend myself." Silence. Every pair of eyes in the courtroom turned toward the 18-year-old defendant standing on trial for a serious felony. Some raised their eyebrows in amusement, while others smirked dismissively. Judge Richard Holloway blinked, then let out a low chuckle, as if this was the most ridiculous thing he'd heard all day. Leaning back in his chair, he crossed his arms and said mockingly, "Oh, this should be interesting. Go ahead, kid. Let's see what you've got." Prosecutor Nathan Brooks shook his head, his smirk widening. To him, this was nothing but a spectacle, a desperate move from a naive boy. But Marcus wasn't laughing. With slow, deliberate steps, he walked toward the defense podium, his eyes as sharp as a blade. "Before I present my argument," Marcus began, his tone composed but firm, "I have a simple request. Please pull up Officer Jason Fuller's GPS records from the night of the alleged crime." The room shifted slightly. At the prosecution's table, Brooks narrowed his eyes, the smugness on his face dimming ever so slightly. He shrugged, his voice thick with sarcasm. Who do you think you are? Some hotshot lawyer? This isn't a courtroom drama. A few jurors chuckled, but Marcus remained unmoved. He simply tilted his head, an air of quiet certainty surrounding him. Judge Holloway tapped his fingers on the desk, watching him closely. Then, with an amused sigh, he gestured to the court technician. Fine, let's check it out. This ought to be good. The courtroom screens flickered to life as the system retrieved Officer Jason Fuller's GPS logs, and then silence. Not a single word was spoken. Even Brooks slowly straightened, his smirk vanishing. Judge Holloway frowned. For the first time since the trial began, he sat up. On the screen, the GPS data confirmed that at the time of the crime, Officer Jason Fuller was nowhere near the crime scene. He was nearly a mile away. The courtroom erupted. Gasps and whispers filled the air. The jury exchanged stunned glances. Reporters scribbled furiously. Even Judge Holloway squinted at the data, his once dismissive expression now shadowed with doubt. Prosecutor Brooks froze. His fingers tightened around the edge of the table, knuckles white. Marcus didn't say a word. He simply clasped his hands together, a faint knowing smile playing on his lips. He had just punched the first hole in their case, and this was only the beginning. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. Prosecutor Nathan Brooks, once so self-assured, now looked visibly uneasy. But Marcus wasn't finished. He wasn't just fighting for his freedom. He was tearing this entire case apart. Stepping up to the podium, Marcus planted his hands firmly on the table, his gaze sweeping over the room, from the jury to Brooks to Judge Holloway, before he finally spoke. Your Honor, do fingerprints alone prove that I was behind the wheel? A simple question, but it hit the courtroom like a thunderclap. A few jurors frowned. One woman arched her brow, clearly reconsidering what she thought she knew. Marcus took a step forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't grandstand. He simply spoke, slow and deliberate. If you try on a jacket in a store and someone shoplifts it later, does that make you a thief? Some jurors leaned in, drawn into a question they hadn't thought to ask before. Nathan Brooks clenched his jaw. He no longer looked as composed as before. Objection, he snapped, his voice a little too sharp. That argument is purely emotional. Fingerprints aren't the same as trying on clothes. Marcus didn't blink. He turned slowly to face Brooks, his voice unwavering. Then tell me, do you have any proof that I actually drove that car? Brooks inhaled, flipping hastily through his files. He had nothing except fingerprints, just fingerprints. But Marcus wasn't done. He reached into his bag and pulled out a thick file. The entire courtroom held its breath. Marcus lifted the file high, then slammed it onto the table with a resounding thud. This, he said, his tone steady but piercing, is the witness statement from the vehicle's owner, Robert McCall. Brooks went rigid. Judge Holloway narrowed his eyes, leaning forward. Marcus flipped through the pages, then read aloud. I saw the thief. He was a white male. Silence. A wave of shock rippled through the courtroom. Jurors who had looked uncertain before suddenly turned to stare at Brooks. Brooks stood frozen, his hands clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Holloway's gaze shifted from Marcus to Brooks, and for the first time since the trial began, his tone darkened with suspicion. Mr. Brooks, why wasn't this document included in the court's files? A single bead of sweat rolled down Brooks' temple. He had just lost control of the trial. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. Prosecutor Nathan Brooks, once so self-assured, now frantically flipped through his case files. His hands trembled slightly, and beads of sweat formed on his brow. The more he read, the more he realized there was no way out. Across from him, Marcus Reed stood tall, his piercing gaze locked onto Brooks like a predator cornering its prey. His voice was low, but each word cut through the silence like a blade. You knew about this all along, didn't you? Brooks' head snapped up, his mouth opened slightly as if to argue, but no words came out. His silence said everything. Judge Richard Holloway watched the prosecutor intently. At first, he had thought this was an open and shut case, just another reckless teenager, another routine conviction. But now, he realized just how wrong he had been. His fingers curled into a tight fist against the polished wooden bench, a flicker of something close to regret flashing across his face. His gaze drifted from Marcus, calm and unshaken, to Brooks, a man unraveling before his eyes. And yet, Marcus wasn't finished. The young defendant turned slightly, his voice steady, authoritative. I request a full fingerprint analysis on the stolen vehicle. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Brooks stiffened, snapping out of his daze. "Objection!" he barked, his voice sharp and desperate. "That's outside the scope of—" Judge Holloway held up a hand. "Request granted. Run the analysis now." A flurry of movement followed. Technicians scrambled to retrieve the data, fingers flying across keyboards. All eyes in the room locked onto the large screen as the system processed the fingerprint records. And then, one of the forensic analysts suddenly stopped. Another leaned closer to the screen, his face visibly paling. "Your Honor." One of the analysts hesitated, his voice no longer carrying the same confidence. "We just found another set of fingerprints on the steering wheel, and they do not belong to the defendant, Marcus Reed." The courtroom imploded. The jury gasped. Brooks turned to stone. "Then who do they belong to?" Judge Holloway's voice was tight, almost deadly serious. The analyst swallowed hard, his eyes scanning the database. When he finally spoke the name, the reaction was instantaneous. "They belong to Jonathan J.T. Carter, a federal fugitive wanted for multiple car thefts across the state." Chaos erupted. Brooks stood frozen, gripping the edge of the prosecution's table. His face was pale, his knuckles white. Marcus took a step forward, his eyes never leaving the prosecutor. "You knew about this all along, didn't you?" His words hung in the air like a death sentence. Brooks swallowed hard, but it was too late. Everyone in that courtroom knew exactly who the guilty party was. The courtroom fell into absolute silence. Every eye was locked onto Judge Richard Holloway, waiting for his final decision. Gone was the arrogant man who had once leaned back in his chair, dismissing Marcus as just another reckless teenager. For the first time, there was something else in his gaze: recognition. He looked at Marcus, the boy the system had condemned before the trial even began. Marcus hadn't begged, he hadn't pleaded, he had fought, with his mind, his words, and the truth, and he had won. Holloway drew in a deep breath, heavy as if carrying the weight of a realization too late to change. He lifted the gavel, holding it suspended in the air for just a second. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Bang! Half the room froze in shock. The jurors who had once smirked, the spectators who had whispered, the officers who had already assumed Marcus was guilty, they could only sit in stunned silence. The other half erupted with relief. From the back of the courtroom, Teresa Reed clutched her hands together, tears streaming down her face, but a smile trembling on her lips. Reporters scrambled to jot down notes. Camera flashes illuminated the tense expressions of those who had just witnessed the impossible. A trial completely turned upside down. Across the room, Prosecutor Nathan Brooks looked like a man who had just been drained of every ounce of energy. His shoulders sagged, his grip on the table white-knuckled. He had nothing left to argue. The game was over. Case dismissed. The defendant, Marcus Reed, is not guilty. The courtroom exploded. Half the room froze in shock. The jurors who had once smirked, the spectators who had whispered, the officers who had already assumed Marcus was guilty, they could only sit in stunned silence. The other half erupted with relief. From the back of the courtroom, Teresa Reed clutched her hands together, tears streaming down her face, but a smile trembling on her lips. Reporters scrambled to jot down notes. Camera flashes illuminated the tense expressions of those who had just witnessed the impossible. A trial completely turned upside down. Across the room, Prosecutor Nathan Brooks looked like a man who had just been drained of every ounce of energy. His shoulders sagged, his grip on the table white-knuckled. He had nothing left to argue. The game was over. In the chaos, Marcus didn't move. He simply closed his eyes and took a deep, steady breath. No cocky grin, no victory pose, just a teenager who had finally been recognized as innocent. And then his mother, Teresa Reed, rushed forward from the gallery, wrapping her arms around him. "My son, you did it." Marcus let out a quiet laugh, resting his head on her shoulder. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Today, justice had spoken. Outside the courthouse, the scorching Atlanta sun cast long shadows on the marble steps where a swarm of reporters waited. Microphones, cameras, and eager eyes locked onto Marcus Reed as he stepped through the heavy courthouse doors. "Marcus, do you think the justice system can change? How does it feel to overturn a case that seemed unwinnable?" The questions came rapid fire, but Marcus didn't stop. He simply smirked, a small, knowing smirk, before pulling up his hoodie, shoving his hands into his pockets, and walking straight through the crowd. His story was over, but the battle was far from finished. From across the street, a deep, gravelly voice cut through the noise. "Reed." Marcus halted. He turned and saw Judge Richard Holloway standing on the courthouse steps, but this time his gaze held no arrogance, no authority. Holloway studied him for a long moment before speaking, his voice measured, deliberate. "You should go to law school." Marcus didn't flinch. He had been expecting this. A faint smile tugged at the corner of his lips, not cocky, just certain. "I already have a plan. One wrongly accused man won his fight, But how many others never get the chance? Justice doesn't happen on its own. It only exists when people are willing to fight for it.